Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aabir. As you can see, you can tweet to me there, but you might want to also email me because I don't check Twitter. How many of you guys can see the fourth dimension? OK, great. None of you know what I'm talking about after this. So this is what we're going to cover after this. I want to tell you a little bit about what data is made of. We all know that it's just numbers, but it's useful to think about the structure in those numbers. We're going to talk a little bit about why we need to care about understanding data as opposed to maybe just shoving it through some prediction engine. We're going to talk about the basic principles of data analysis. I want to introduce you to the data space, which is kind of a space just like what we live in, but the fourth or 100th dimensional space where you can actually picture these data points in. Then we'll talk a little bit about k-means clustering, PCA, discuss the intuition behind t-SNE, and then I'll give you my 10 steps to being a data scientist, patent pending. So what is data made of? It is just numbers, right? We don't really need to think about it any more than that. But what's important is the structure. So images can have pixel values for each location. Audio signals can have intensities and frequencies and intensities at different points in time. And databases, of course, are just kind of rows and columns that contain information because of the structure in them. Otherwise, it's just random letters and numbers. So the structure, of course, can get arbitrarily complicated. I think it's important to remember why we also want to understand data besides wanting the technology of using it. We don't just want to push it through an engine, get predictions, have benchmarks and accuracy and things like that. But because data is really the experimental observation of the present, it is the foundation for any kind of understanding or learning that we can get from anything that we observe. So these are a few differences between just raw data and understanding that I've compiled from various kinds of insights. I think it's important, again, to remember that understanding is based on hypotheses that can be tested. It's based on uncertainty. And data is just the raw number, the raw observation. Data has a stagnant structure, whereas understanding is kind of mutable. You can apply it to different contexts. You can infer it in different cases. And data has no real basis in science or learning. You need to extract understanding from these observations to really have any kind of science or learning. And that brings us to kind of the simplest thing that you might ever be able to say when you look at data, which is that a data point, if you know nothing else about it, is probably similar to data points that are near it. And data in general can then be looked at, and you can try to find patterns in it that give you meta information, which contributes to our understanding and our learning and our science. So that brings us to the concept of the data space, which because we can all picture 2 dimensions, and we see each other in 2 dimensions, which sometimes looks like 3. It's a neat trick of the brain. It's easy to think of 2 dimensions. So each row is just basically a sample. It's just a point. And it has 2 properties which kind of form the 2-dimensional space. As you can see here, you plot it, and each of these attributes actually have a value that manifests all of this information in a space. Of course, we assume that each of these properties is equally important and is about scaled to the same value, because if you're comparing, say, salaries with eyebrow thickness, you might have extremely different values. You could have, again, here I've shown birds and their weights and heights, and you could have a variety of different properties that you're looking at. Capital One might care a lot about this. And supply chain companies and Amazon in particular might care a lot about stuff like this. So we can extend the concept of actually trying to manifest this information in a space to 3 dimensions, and it becomes a little harder to visualize this. I mean, you can't really get the sense of where these points are, what their relative locations and distances are from each other and things like that in 3 dimensions. But that actually doesn't stop the concept of this space from being useful, which is what I want to walk you guys through today. High dimensional data can just basically have a huge number of columns or attributes, and you can still technically plot it in a space. You just can't see that space. You might have to ask Christopher Nolan to help you with that. Every row is still a point. It has a number of attributes, and you can think about this space. And now we come to the point where I tell you how that's useful. So let's think about one of the things that kind of translates naturally from the two-dimensional space, where data points are kind of similar to other data points that are near them. One of the useful things that you get from 2 dimensions is that you can plot stuff, and you can actually immediately identify inconsistencies. Because why are the shorter birds heavier and the taller birds lighter? This doesn't make sense, right? So either you have some kind of biological anomaly, or you probably made a mistake somewhere, and you'd like to fix it. So visualization is always kind of important, and it's useful, and it helps you kind of ground your conclusions in some kind of base intuition. So once you fix it, you can kind of identify again that there are 2 broad clusters here, and that correlates well with something that you would expect biologically, right? Male and female birds. This is something that you can see in 2 dimensions. But what about when you have high dimensional data and when you can't actually plot points in this space? You would like to have some kind of objective metric, some kind of hardcore mathematically defined metric for putting these points together and saying, hey, these are closer and those are closer, and this is how we cluster them separately. That brings us to k-means clustering, which is a really simple and powerful way to do this. Before we get into k-means clustering, I want to remind you guys that k-means clustering is based on the metric of distance. So we can think of distance as in you're sitting there and I'm sitting here, and these are the distances between us. And that does make sense in certain contexts, but it's important later on to think about the contexts in which this distance might not make so much sense. So k-means clustering basically just takes your whole data set, and you tell it the number of clusters that you'd like to identify in it. And it just gives you a list saying, OK, each of these data points corresponds to one of the whatever k clusters you asked me to find. And it does this, again, based on some notion of similarity. How close are data points within the same cluster to each other? And then it runs an algorithm until convergence. The animation on the right is actually going to make that a little intuitively clear to you. I'm not going to run deep into the math. So these are the 4 initial clusters, the green points. And it looks at the points that are closest to them. And it just finds the centroid of all of those points and says, OK, that's our next center. And it keeps doing that until some sort of convergence and says, OK, based on these 4 converged points, so to speak, I can identify clusters based on what points are closest to them. If this sounds simple, that's because it is. But it turns out to be extremely useful. I'm sure Capital One has built lots of layers of cool stuff onto this, but it's actually the basis for a lot of systems that approve loans automatically, that decide whether you're going to pay them back or not. Customer behavior and how to classify different customers. Tumors somehow have a whole range of parameters that you can just shove into a k-means cluster and say, hey, these are cancerous, so the ones around that are probably cancerous. Image classification is not so cool anymore. And students, again, basically any kind of behavior can actually be clustered really well using k-means clustering, which is weird because you don't necessarily expect the concept of a distance to make sense in all of these contexts, but it has in these cases, so who am I to argue? It does have limitations, of course. It's not reproducible because you kind of pick these 4 random points and then wait for it to converge. The real clusters, by which I mean what the data's shape is in the real high-dimensional space, might not actually map well onto this concept. It might have a non-spherical shape like a boomerang, and then you're saying, oh, it's in the middle of the boomerang, but it's spread into this weird kind of curve in a high-dimensional space. And then you, of course, have the problem of outliers. The implementation in Python is exceedingly simple, so you literally just have to Google it. Let's now move, because I kind of set this up. I said, hey, we can use distance, but that's not the greatest thing to do. And here's what I think is really cool, which is what PCA uses. It looks at the concept of variance. So if you guys are familiar with statistical variance, that's essentially what PCA is based on. And this is going to give you a little intuition on why that works so well. So because the distance between these points might not always be the best measure of their similarity, you might want to think about how much they're spread over space. So if all of you were just seated on one chair, there would be really low variance. There would be very little information in your positions as, say, 50 people. But it's because you're spread out that there's more information about your locations, right? So the informativeness of this data is kind of measured by how spread out you are. And that's what PCA uses. It looks at the direction that your data is kind of most spread out in. And it's really cool to think of how this statistical concept that you might have been annoyed and had to calculate in some course at some point actually translates so usefully to what the most informative angle, literally, to look at your data from is. The most informative direction in this data is kind of what it's most spread out along. And then you have a less informative direction, which is kind of what it's less spread out along. And when you look at variance, I want to get a little quantitative about this so that you can really see how it helps. I want to look at the projections of these points onto the x and y axes. And that's basically just how we project things. And then you kind of look at the counts of these. And you can see that they're spread out along both of these axes. Along the height axis, you have a few of those points with lower values, a few with higher values. And if you were to try and cluster these, even with k-means clustering, you'd see that there are actually clusters along both of these axes, right? But when you look at the data in the two-dimensional space, you see that you only really need 2 clusters. You don't have to look at these 4 cases. And PCA looks at variance as a way to reduce the number of dimensions that you really have to consider. So let's look at the actual values of variance for height and weight. That's the formula that you might have hated at some point. So the actual values along the height axis and the weight axis are about 15 and 19. And now I want to take you to, instead of using both of these directions, how we can even use an arbitrary guess for some kind of incline that might be explaining this data, which would allow us, when we generalize it to higher dimensions, to actually not use all of our 100 columns, but to say, hey, you know what, these are the ones that kind of matter. And in fact, not just these ones, but these ones in a certain combination, which is what you mean by an angle or a direction in space. So let's pick this random hybrid direction that I just kind of did because it's convenient. Project the points down onto these directions, like we did onto the x and y axes before. So each point now has a coordinate on this new axis. This is 11.6 units for this particular point. And you can calculate the variance of these projections, right? And we had 19 and 15 or something like that before. And you see that there's much more variance along this direction. It's about 27. And that just shows that this direction is kind of explaining how your data is spread out. It's saying that, hey, if you look at this direction, it tells me much more than looking at these individual ones. And because the new direction explains more of this data, if you think about it, that's what you want a feature that explains your data to make predictions based off, right? Another useful way to look at this is to look at how the clusters kind of condense into just needing one axis to separate them out. And of course, when you're moving to higher dimensions, this is kind of an implementation point. But you don't want to have to look at the intersections and all of these things. So you'd like to center all of your data around the mean, which is why you would subtract the averages of all of these different values in each dimension from your data set. You'd like to have it centered around 0, as you can see here. And that helps you find these directions of maximum and minimum variance. So when you actually run PCA, you would find these 2 directions, which wasn't the arbitrary one that I found, which gave you 27 as the variance. You got 30 and 1.44, which is significantly different from just what your data was plotted on, which was height and weight with about 15 and 19. So PCA basically generalizes this to n dimensions, just like k-means clustering looked at how we can circle a cluster and say that's a cluster. It uses linear algebra, and there's a lot of jargon. Again, I'm not going to get into the details of the mathematical implementation, but this is basically what it does. And this is the input. You'd basically just, again, shove your database into PCA. And you could optionally select the number of principal components that you want to identify. But technically, as you saw in this example, if there are 2 dimensions, then you would have that many number of directions that would explain variances in reducing orders. There would be one direction in a 100-dimension space that explains the most variance, and then there would be a second that explains slightly less, and a third. And there would actually be 100 directions. So the output would actually be those directions in this case. And because you now have the directions, you can find the values of each of these data points along each of these directions. And that gives you actually much more explainability in what you're looking at. And that's why PCA is so commonly used to identify features that are useful for prediction. I personally would advise using it more for exploration, because otherwise you'd have to run PCA on your data set every time it's updated. But my main affinity with PCA is because of how it really helps you explore your data set and understand it in more human terms and say, oh, these are the factors that are actually explaining my data set, and this is where things matter, and this is where the variance is the highest. So again, we're not going to get into the mathematical implementation, but PCA is also used for a huge number of applications. Like I said, feature extraction, because you want to not have so many numbers to consider. PCA helps you reduce the number of numbers that you just have to look at to explain what's happening. Behavior classification again. Data exploration, it's really interesting in general to just kind of apply PCA to a data set and to plot it. And if you have human understandable analogs for those coordinates, to look at how those different dimensions might be influencing the space. I'll show you that with the Netflix example. It's also the preliminary processing for a lot of applications, because while you might not want to use it immediately for feature extraction to say, oh, these numbers are more important, it helps you kind of develop an intuition for what your data set looks like. Of course, PCA also does have limitations. There's no guarantee. Like I said, based on where the points are in the real space, you don't know that PCA is prioritizing the real directions that explain it. It depends, again, heavily on the topology. The boomerang is always a problem. And it requires smart normalization, because like I said, the eyebrow thickness might not be a good comparison if you also have tens of billions of dollars. And it is a black box, because you would have to apply it on a data set every time it changes in order to reflect the changes in the data set. You can't do one small tweak and say, oh, we added this point in. Could you deal with that? So PCA is also extremely easy to implement. If you look at this, the first 4 lines are basically just getting stuff ready, and it's just 2 lines that actually implement it. It runs extremely fast because it uses linear algebra, which data science at the hardware level is in love with. And let's get now to the demo. So the Netflix problem that I'm going to talk about today is basically a data set of customers and what movies they might have watched. So each row is a customer, and each column is a film. And if the customer has seen that film and rated it, then the number in there is the rating that they gave it. And if they haven't seen it, there's just a 0. So I used normalization to bring this center to 0, while also keeping the films that haven't been seen at 0. So that clearly doesn't change anything. And this is because I want there to be a kind of centric metric, like indifference if you haven't seen the film, and a positive value if you liked it more than you like the average film that you've seen, and obviously a negative one if you didn't like it. So what does Netflix really want to do, right? It wants to recommend to you movies that you would want to see based on things that you've seen before. But it actually knows not just what you've seen, but what everyone else has seen. And if in some high-dimensional space, it can look at what really explains the difference between its customers, and then say, hey, based on what puts customers closer or farther apart in the sense of variance, if you're close to someone, you probably like movies that they liked. So I know where you are, I know who's close to you, and I can now recommend to you movies that they liked that you haven't seen. It's rudimentary, and it's probably not what Netflix does, but it's a good example for how PCA works. And it's extremely useful to maybe a business analyst or somebody who wants to help AI start making films to actually see how to generate appeal, because it's kind of getting into the nitty-gritties of the problem and extracting insight and understanding from the data set that they have. So yeah, so we're basically just using the same a data point is known by the company it keeps approach. I want to ask you guys a question. Why do you think, OK, I kind of gave it away. K-means clustering will not be helpful here. But why do you think that might be? Does anybody have any guesses? OK, so it's because the concept of a distance really would not translate well to a space with maybe like 10,000 movies, and you liking one of them with a 1.3, and you not having watched some of them with a 0, and you disliking another with a 2.3. How do you really use those points in space and say, OK, the distance between us is so much, and that means something? It really doesn't mean anything. And that's why you kind of need a measure of how points are spread out in space, where the concept of a direction rather than a distance becomes extremely useful. So yeah, that's a cue for me to do the demo. So here's the code. It is up on my GitHub, but all I'm doing here is basically, can everybody see? OK. So I'm importing my data set. I had to run some pre-processing on it to make it easy to read with a sparse matrix and stuff like that. But this is the list of movie titles that Netflix looks at. There's Dinosaur Planet and a bunch of other stuff that you probably haven't seen. This is me reading my data set. It's a sparse matrix, as you can see. These are the first few values of the data set, the non-zero ones. The code here is just me kind of normalizing the data. Again, I only want to subtract the average of non-zero values because I want zero values to stay the same. I look at zero as being no information, indifference. And now I truncate my data because I don't have infinite RAM. And I just look for the coordinates in this space. And this is actually the coordinate in the data space because each column is a movie. These are the movies and their values that explain the most variance in the data set. So you see that you probably don't know a lot of these films, right? That's something that I noticed too, and we're going to get to why that is in just a minute. It might sound weird to us now, right? Because you'd expect that like maybe super popular films should actually decide who's where in the data set, and that should explain the difference. But if you think about it for one more second, you realize that that actually doesn't make any sense, because if everybody likes something, that doesn't explain any variance. And if everybody hates something, it doesn't explain any variance. The real way that you get to know a person is by asking them a controversial question, not by something that you expect the answer to with a great degree of certainty. And that's exactly what gets reflected in the results of running this algorithm. So let's get back to the results. So what's the story? What we find is that these films that you probably haven't heard of, unless there are some really niche tastes here, all of these films are actually cult films. They've had really polarizing opinions. They've had opinions on IMDb, like it's great for old fans of the show, but still a 4 on 10. I didn't like it, but it would really resonate with this small group of people. And that really explains variance in your database, right? This is from Wikipedia. Although critics were not impressed, audiences seem to love it. Polarizing opinions, things that are really kind of different for different kinds of audiences. And that really pulls your space apart. That means that there are some people in that corner of the room and some people on that corner of the room. And that's the most information. Mainly negative reviews from critics, but 66 million. That's nice. The majority of critics responded favorably, but Roger Ebert hated it. So that's really the story that PCA kind of unearths in your data set. It helps you not just maybe find the right feature, which I wouldn't honestly recommend if you're putting something in production, but it helps you understand your data. It helps you get science and understanding and knowledge from your data. So let's move now to t-SNE. t-SNE is something that I feel deserves honorable mention because it's actually a lot more intuitive and robust than PCA in a lot of ways, but it does have some limitations in how you can use it and its implementation. It's not as fast. It uses the concept of information theory to actually look at, in a high-dimensional space, this becomes a little easier to, it's easier to understand why this is important. But it looks at what points explain other points in terms of how much information they carry about each other. So say in this two-dimensional room, people who are sitting near each other are explaining more about each other's locations. And that's easy to see, and you'd say, yeah, I guess they're also just closer to each other. But if you bump this up into 100 dimensions, it kind of doesn't translate as much. Like I said, the notion of distance doesn't make any sense when you move to movies in this space. And the notion of actually explaining information about each other using metrics from information theory is robust in that high-dimensional space. That's what t-SNE uses. Just some raw intuition on how this works, which I hope might help, is to look at a histogram of the distributions of these points along each of these axes. And then to say, hey, it looks like these 2 points kind of explain each other well because they're close to each other. But a different way of saying that is to say that they, they represent similar spaces in the distribution, and their distributions or their frequencies are actually similar to each other. So that's just a little bit of intuition how t-SNE works. To actually get into the depths of it, you'd have to understand something called the Shannon entropy, or a metric of information. But again, the implementation of t-SNE is exceedingly simple. It's really easy to use. It's really easy to even just try out on your data set as preliminary exploration. And with that, I leave you with my 10 steps to being a data scientist, which is to just go in and get your hands dirty, figure out what an algorithm does, how to use it, shove your data through it, because you're not trying to put it in production yet, and understand these algorithms, because actually trying to get into the depths of the mathematics gives you much more insight. It allows you to generate knowledge and learning and understanding, which even if your end goal is just to make predictions or to classify stuff, you will be able to do better when you understand better the problem that you're working on. So I hope I haven't been too mathematically rigorous, as you can see. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Hi. So for PCA and for t-SNE, there's some parameters that you have to set, right? So PCA, like the number of the clusters, and t-SNE as well. So like, what's a good way to go like about that, or like what should like we go more into to understand how to best kind of set those parameters?
So with PCA, there's the real parameter that you only need to care about is how many of these directions you're trying to find. So what ends up happening is that oftentimes you'd set that parameter based on how much you expect to be able to compute in a reasonable time. That isn't the most scientific way to go about it. Ideally, you should start at a really high value and degrade and also increase and see how different your performances are. Because PCA does give you a measure of the explained variance. Like I said, we calculated the variance along this new direction, and we found that it performed better than the original directions. PCA will give you that explained variance, and the rate at which that explained variance drops off as you add more directions is a really good indicator of whether you're reaching a good amount of detail, so to speak, in your data set or not.
So, and then to add to that then, so the more kind of variance, or like the higher kind of variance along these axes, the better, or?
Not necessarily, because if you just have like this spherical blob in a high dimensional space, then pretty much all of your variances are going to be the same. But what you care about with PCA usually is to try and not care about so many of those directions. So you'd like for there to be high variance on your first one, and then significantly lower on the second, and then significantly lower on your third. And you'd really like for it to start decaying to something relatively negligible compared to the first one at some point. But if they're all kind of large, that probably is a sign the PCA wasn't a good choice, and that it's not helping you as much as you'd like it to have. With t-SNE, just to complete the answer, there's a parameter called the perplexity, which is, again, information theory would help kind of solidify these analogies, but it's kind of a measure of how much of the default amount that you expect things to be spread out. So again, I would say to kind of play with the results a little bit, and to always start with a point and have it much less than that, much higher than that, have a range. But hyperparameter exploration, I think, was a part of one of the other talks, and it's a whole field on its own, so don't take my word for it. Yeah. Yeah, someone here. Should we wait for the mic?
If you have two clusters that are very close, you say if you had 3 or 4 different things you're looking at, if those two are close enough, bean-shaped almost, is there any way to make that distinct and clear, that you, because that may be something very important, 2 slightly different shades of the same.
So when clusters have like kind of an inconvenient shape, let's call it, it usually becomes really important to kind of be able to visualize what they look like. And because you're saying, like, if they're kind of bean-shaped and the data is kind of saying that they're just one, You'd only know that they're bean-shaped if you were kind of able to visualize them. And the really nice thing about PCA is that it looks at the directions that matter. And then it gives you the values of those data points on each of those directions. So you can actually look at kind of the shape of the data 2 dimensions at a time. You could look at the values of all of your data points along the most important direction and the second most important direction. And you'd get some sense of how it's spread out. And then the second and the third and the first and the third. And you could keep going like that. And that would actually help you to identify if there's like this kind of weird bean-shaped structure, as you call it, in your data set. Right. So you'd like to not just take k-means saying, hey, all of these points are in one big cluster. You'd like to not take that at face value. PCA helps you actually spread those points out and see, OK, this is what's happening. This is what k-means said about these points. But when I plot them with the most important directions, according to their variances, this is what it looks like. And it's much more spread out than I thought it should be. And that would help you then take your next step. Yep.
What would you say are the risks of using PCA to like whiten your data? To, like if you reduce the number of components that you have to kind of denoise, quote unquote, and then project it back. Like, do you risk if your data is not structured and doesn't have a linear relationship, that you lose important information?
That's a really good question. So I get this question, the last part of your question I get a lot, which is that, oh, what if there isn't a linear relationship in your data? But PCA actually doesn't care about a linear relationship between your data and what you're trying to predict, because PCA doesn't say anything about what you're trying to predict. All it says is that this is actually how your data itself differs from itself. So non-linearities in the data, so to speak, are not really a problem, because it's just looking at kind of a spread. One really useful way to think about PCA is to think of your data in this really high-dimensional space, and then think of a high-dimensional ellipse, or like a high-dimensional oval that kind of fits all of it, and then look at what the main directions of those ellipses are. I'm not sure if that analogy helps. But as you can see, that has nothing to do with whether there's a linear relationship between the features in that space and what you're trying to predict. It will still tell you that this is how your data is spread out. But if there are non-linearities between those features and what you're trying to predict, you'd have to deal with them anyway. PCA will only tell you that, hey, this is what's different in your data from one point to another, and not from this point to what it might be, like a yes or no, or a male or a female, or anything like that.
Hi. Are there any scenarios where I would think differently about applying any of these methods to a sparse or dense data set?
That's also a really good question. So personally, I would say that especially for feature extraction, like PCA is still sometimes used, I would not recommend it at all on a sparse data set. I would not recommend it on binary data sets for sure, and discrete ones are still a little dicey. Because what it's really only doing is showing me a spread and telling me that these are the components that matter on that spread. So I can use that to gain understanding and insight, but if you're putting something in production, I would definitely not recommend PCA on a sparse data set. It would not do a good job of actually using that information, or rather, I wouldn't assume that it's going to always do a good job of extracting the most important thing and sending it out, because at the very basic of it, it's still using a different metric called variance as opposed to distance, and that just doesn't work well in a sparse data set with a lot of zeros that kind of pull your averages into certain areas. What it does do is basically allow you to probe the data set and say, OK, what's happening? Maybe this is the spread, or this is the reason that it varies along this axis, and stuff like that. There would be a lot of problems with kind of trying to just use this as a basis for identifying features and pushing that into production.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? Going once, going twice, 3 times? Thank you.
All right.